So the first thing I want to say is just to give everyone a heads up that the scheduling originally, when I put this together back in June or whatever it was, as Viking Fest approached, has had to be changed for the final talk. Talk number 6, this is number 5, talk number 6 will not be 2 weeks from today, but 3 weeks from today. This has been put up on the parish online calendar. It'll appear in whatever Brian Intelligence sends out. So just to keep that in mind, usually we'd go every 2 weeks, and that was the plan, but I'll be away for a talk, and I hadn't put all these things together at that time. So next time we will have one more talk. It'll be the final talk on Olga of Alaska, and that will not be 2 weeks from now, but 3 weeks from now. Okay, I forget the exact date, but we'll figure that one out. So that's something we want to keep in mind, okay? So today, in the next 45 minutes or so, I want to present to you the life and the historical circumstances of another saint who will be painted up in our wonderfully expected barrel vault in our ceiling in the temple. And this saint is Saint Philip of Moscow, Metropolitan of Moscow. And he takes his place up there along so many other saints, now four of whom we talked about. And though we started with Olaf, who's an 11th century saint, I've tried to make them more or less otherwise. I've tried to make them chronological. I've tried to connect as best I can the introduction to whatever particular saint we're talking about by relating to what we've already learned about the history of saints in the church. And so if you'll remember last time, to refer to my last presentation 2 weeks ago, we talked about Theodora, the Empress of Byzantium. We talked about models of statecraft, models of Christian statecraft, and how there were really two broad models that we can identify, even though they're pretty abstract. And these two models are symphony, which is the model where the emperor, or in her case empress, works in symphony with, in harmony with, the church leadership, especially patriarchs, bishops, that kind of thing, for the benefit of the church. That's the ideal. That was found in the life of Justinian, for instance, in many ways. He did a lot of things, including calling the Fifth Ecumenical Council, but he did a lot of other things. He rebuilt Hagia Sophia. Matushka there is writing about him right now as we speak, or about his time. So he did a lot of things. There's a lot going on in Justinian's reign that had a big impact on his on the life of the church, beneficial impact. But the other model we called Caesaropapism. It's a weird word. It doesn't have any place historically in Byzantium. It comes from Caesar, meaning emperor, and papism, which was modeled on what the papacy became after the 11th century schism. So it's like completely ahistorical. But modern historians have used it, and it's more or less effective. And until we come up with an alternative, I use the term Caesaropapism too, to describe a situation where instead of working in harmony with the church leadership, the ruler, emperor in the case of Byzantium, overwhelms the church with his own, could be her own, heretical or unhelpful kind of influence. So the great case of this, the great example of this is Leo III, emperor who launches iconoclasm in the 8th century. That's the great example of Caesaropapism, where he insists that icons be destroyed against the interests of the church, against the well-being of the church, introduces that heresy, has to be dealt with eventually. Theodora, whom we talked about last time, brings that whole century-and-a-half process to a conclusion when, as the successor on the throne in Constantinople, she restores icons, right? She restores icons. So we talked about all those things, and they'll be relevant as we talk today about the life and times of Philip of Moscow, Saint Philip of Moscow, Metropolitan of Moscow, who's a 16th century saint, 16th century, 1500s, and he lived in Russia. So we'll talk about him today. So let me start by, I guess I've already started, let me continue by now talking about the historical background more immediate to Philip. What was Philip's Russia like? So now we're talking about a place different than Byzantium, which we talked a lot about. Talked about Byzantium with Theodora. Before Theodora, we talked about Basil the Great, that he lived in Byzantium. Talked about Catherine the Great Martyr, who lived in the Roman Empire, even if it was before Byzantium as such. Now we're talking about a different political system, the Russian one, but it has a lot of continuity with Byzantium, as we'll see. But let's just talk about that state and that civilization called Russia. So here, for instance, I want to start just by, especially these days, there's a lot of distinction being made between Russia and Rus. You may have heard that. You may have seen the term Rus, R-U-S, used a lot. And historically, people who lived in what is modern Russia or Ukraine or Belarus, they use that term Rus, not Russia. The term Russia, in Russian Rossiya, is different than Rus. The Russians have the term Rus, and they have the word Rossiya. Rossiya is the big empire that ultimately gets established around Moscow, and then is inherited, as it were, by Peter the Great, and becomes the great empire that gives birth to the Russian Revolution of 1917. That's Rossiya. Today, the Russian Federation is kind of like the political kind of descendant of Rossiya, Russia, and people outside of the Russian Federation, like Ukrainians especially today, who are at war with Russia, they make a lot out of the differences here between these words, and they say, oh, there's Rus, but we're not part of Russia, we're part of Rus. Now that's, technically speaking, just a fine thing to say, but it's a little complicated when you give a presentation, in parish church, for instance, about the history of Russia. So I'm just going to use the word Russia, and I hope you'll forgive me if it doesn't sound perfectly aligned with how those words are being used today. But I'm just talking about Russia at different phases of her historical development, some of which included Kiev and Ukraine, and more recently, of course, don't, but they certainly did during the time we're speaking of, in the 16th century. So, and before. So what was Russian Christendom then like from the start? Well, first of all, we have to go back and just summarize real quickly what Reader Vladimir here knows plenty about, and that is the life of Saint Vladimir of Kiev. Saint Vladimir of Kiev. Saint Vladimir of Kiev was a pagan ruler who came to power in the lands of the Rus. There, I use the word, it's the last time I'll do so. The lands of Russia in the 900s as a pagan ruler. Really brutal, really, absolutely, immoral and violent and horrible. That's just how politics were. The politics of Russia at this time had inherited a lot of the governing principles, if you can call them principles, of the Vikings, which is kill all your enemies and rape and pillage and destroy, and human life means nothing to you, and so forth. Well, by 980, Vladimir has come to power in Kiev, which was the first and most important of a network of Russian cities, such as like Novgorod. You may have heard of Novgorod before. And these big important cities were all kind of knit together into one political system, one state that had its connections between the different rulers of those cities. But the chief ruler resided at this time anyway in Kiev. And this is Vladimir, beginning in 980. He becomes what's called the Grand Prince, the Great Prince of Russia, of what we might call Kievan Russia, a Russia centered on a capital in Kiev. Kiev on the Dnieper River, which flows south into the Black Sea and ultimately connects Russia to Byzantium, Christian Byzantium. But for now, Russia is very pagan in her character. And so when Vladimir comes to power, he tries to advance the pagan religion. He was really into the worship of a god of warfare, hence the Viking kind of heritage, named Perun. And this god of warfare, Perun, even erected a wooden statue of him on the hills of overlooking the Dnieper River, and ordered his people to worship him, and thought this would revive what would seem to be a kind of slowing political system that he ruled over. It didn't work, and by within a few years of coming to power, he decides that as a sincere believer, and by the way, he was a real believer. I mean, this was not all just politics or some sort of cynicism. He was a real believer, and he decided to send out emissaries throughout the world, according to the Chronicles, to check out the world religions because he was not so sure about his anymore in Perun. Well, you may know the story. I hope you do. If you went through catechesis with me, you probably know the story. These emissaries come back and they report on all the places they've been and the people they've seen and the religions they've studied, and they reject Judaism, they reject Islam, and they reject Western, Germanic, Latin Christianity, and finally recommend Byzantine Greek Christianity to Vladimir. And based on their recommendation, Vladimir converts to Christianity by calling for Greek clergy, or Orthodox Christian Greek clergy, to come and baptize him and his people. The report by these emissaries, by the way, is famous. This is the passage where they come back and they report to him, "We visited all these different lands and saw how they worshipped, but when we went among the Greeks, we did not know whether we were in heaven or on earth. It was so beautiful." That's what they say. And we cannot go back to that which is bitter, having tasted something so sweet as Christianity, as it's celebrated and lived out liturgically in Constantinople. So Vladimir converts about 988. He calls on his people to convert, and there's a mass baptism in the Dnieper River. And from that point forward, Russia is predominantly a Christian land. Now this is 988, so a little bit before the Great Schism. So when that happens, 1054 and beyond, took a while for that to set in, Russia is pretty firmly in the Eastern and what we today call the Orthodox. I mean, it was Orthodox back then, but it was also Catholic back then. It's still Catholic today, as a matter of fact. But these words, these adjectives get used a lot. We just have to think about what words we're using. Russia becomes part of the Orthodox Church and firmly identifies with the Orthodox Church through the centuries that follow. So after Vladimir, well, actually I should say beginning with Vladimir, Russia establishes a very strong Christian culture that St. Philip of Moscow, some 5 centuries later, will really be influenced by. And so I might just kind of mention some of its principles. Well, first of all, I could just say that Vladimir himself, he kind of showed a tendency toward conversion in Christianity that we might call evangelical maximalism. I like that phrase, so I'll use it. Evangelical maximalism. That is to say, you take the gospel and you try to live it out to its maximum. You don't find compromises, you don't start to box it in. I mean, isn't that orthodoxy, especially as we look around us today? Like, we're into the maximum, right? Like, we do the full meal deal, as one of my converts, one of my catechumens put it at another parish once. This is the full meal deal when it comes to Christianity. And Vladimir really shows us this. He really just dives in. He just dives in. I mean, there's all sorts of things we can point to. He was notorious for having lots of concubines at his court. It's quite a wild court. And he dismisses them all and takes one Byzantine Orthodox princess, Anna was her name, as his wife, and is faithful to her, as far as we can tell, for the remainder of her life. One wife, he becomes monogamous, in other words. In a culture like his, that was like, what are you doing? Like, what a pansy kind of thing. But no, this was what he did. He took the gospel to its maximum. And he said, I don't care about our own Slavic, kind of pagan, social, sexual, whatever kind of tradition. I'm a Christian now. I'm going to do it the Byzantine way, the Christian way. So what other things does he do? For instance, he opens his court, which was, as I say, known for kind of wild parties. He opens it up, he calls them love feasts. And he invites people from throughout the town of Kiev to come and participate. So there's, in other words, he's opening the court and welcoming people that he doesn't even know. He also sends a bread wagon around Kiev on Saturdays, and he orders the drivers to give bread to anyone who needs it. In other words, charity. Most dramatically of all, he even proposes the abolition of capital punishment. Vladimir does, capital punishment. And it's actually the bishops who talk him out of it. But you can see how radical he applied the gospel. I mean, I don't know how well he read, if at all, but when he heard the Sermon on the Mount, okay, that's what I've got to do. I got to forgive my enemies. I got to love my enemies. I got to do kind things to people who abuse me and do wrongfully to me, or to my state that I rule. And the bishop said, so sorry, no, wait, you're going too far. You're the ruler. You've got to execute, murderers and rapists and people like that. And so they talked him out of it. But there was this tendency from the beginning to maximize the gospel of Jesus Christ in the person of Vladimir and the state he helped establish. So these are some really remarkable things. And they played out in the lives of a couple of his sons. When Vladimir died in 1015, he reigned from 980 to 1015. 988 is when he converts. Some say 987. We'll just go with 988. 1015, he dies, and he has a lot of sons left over. And some of these sons do what Dad did before he became Christian. They want to go to war with each other. One is named Sviatopolk, and he wants to gain all the power for himself and kill his brothers to do so. Well, two of his brothers, sons of Vladimir, are Boris and Gleb, or more properly, Boris and Gleb. And they're both very young. Boris is like maybe 20 or something like this. Gleb is a teenager, maybe even a little bit younger. We don't really know. And these two had been baptized under Vladimir's influence. Sviatopolk was just a pagan-minded renegade. And Sviatopolk uses his power to go to war against Boris, I'll just call him Boris, it's easier in English, Boris and Gleb. And when his army comes to Boris's camp, Boris gives orders to stand down and not to fight back, because after all, it's his brother, and it would be a sin to go to war against his brother, even though his brother wants to kill him. And so the brother's army comes in to his camp, and they slaughter Boris. They put him to death while he's, according to the Chronicles, while he's at prayer, actually. And so Boris is killed, and Gleb, the younger brother, is killed. And so these two sons of Vladimir themselves become examples or models of the political culture of this nascent Russian Christendom. And their models, as models, they represent what's often called kenoticism. Kenoticism. This is a technical term coming from the Greek word kenosis or kenosis, which means emptying, as in self-emptying. As in Philippians 2, Christ, who had all power, emptied himself and became a servant, took on the form of a servant. And this is something we find in historians of Russian Christian culture have found this in the Russian tradition, that this self-emptying and sacrificial giving and surrendering of power in the face of power is a kind of a built-in part of the Russian political culture, beginning with Vladimir and his sons Boris and Gleb. They become the first canonized saints of Russia, known as passion bearers. Passion bearers. People who experienced at some level, even though they were rulers and had power at their disposal, experienced at some level the same self-emptying passion of Jesus Christ. And so think about that. From the start, and this all happens in 1015, the year Vladimir dies. From the start, Russia has established you might call it, official political culture in which the first two saints, the first canonized Russian saints, the first two canonized Russian saints are rulers who surrender their power. Like, how do you build a powerful state on that, right? But there's this ideal. There's this ideal. Right from the start, it's the official thing. Does that mean all Russian rulers since, we're going to see one today, the one who kills Philip actually, it did not follow the example, the kenotic example of Boris, but this becomes a kind of official kind of expectation, or if not expectation, at least model for behavior in politics. How different that is from Byzantium, where there's never the repudiation of that old Roman autocratic ideal. that the ruler owns, and he's the most powerful figure, and everyone cowers in front of him. The Byzantine court was like this place you go and the ruler, the emperor, sits in. They even had at one point in Byzantium, they had a chair that would be lifted up in the air when people would come and talk to the emperor. You'd come up and you'd kind of like come up and you'd count down from the emperor, and suddenly his chair, his throne would lift up in the air and he'd be looking down on you. And this kind of overwhelming authority was expressed in Byzantium. In Russia, what a difference this evangelical maximalism brought. So this is the legacy of Saint Vladimir, and we can look at some examples of how it played out in the centuries that followed, as we especially consider the time and life of Saint Philip. Now, after Vladimir, a couple centuries after Vladimir, Russia underwent a political catastrophe, and this was the Mongol invasions. Russia had a relatively stable, though very decentralized political system in Kievan Russia, the period when Kiev was the political center of Russia, up until the 1200s. And then the Mongols come, they explode out of Central Asia, and they conquer virtually all of Russia, and they just devastate everything they see. They burn down all the cities, they kill all the people, they rape all the women, they steal all the treasures. There's almost nothing left. Almost nothing left. Kiev, for instance, is just like one account of it by a German traveler who comes through in Kiev in 1242 is when Kiev falls. He comes through and he just finds a bunch of smoldering ruins. Like there's nothing left. This great city was just burned down, destroyed. And so what happens is that there's this real tumultuous experience, politically and militarily, that just ruins Russian political unity. And it lasts for a couple of centuries, even more. It lasts for a couple of centuries, during which Russians lived under what was called the Mongol yoke. And it's only broken in the 1400s when another Russian city rises to great strength and uses that strength, especially its military and political strength, to repudiate the Mongol yoke and reestablish unity of Russia, or what we call the Russias, the Ruses. And this city, of course, is Moscow. So by the 1400s, Moscow has emerged as the most powerful of several states in Russia, including Kiev and Novgorod and others. And her rulers are really powerful-minded people. And they take the leadership in driving out the Mongols definitively. In the case in the 14th century, Dmitry Donskoy is a famous Russian Moscow prince who fights the Mongols and defeats them. And from this point forward, the Mongols were no longer capable of tyrannizing the Russians. It took another century under Ivan III, called Ivan the Great, not to be confused with Ivan the Terrible. There's two big Ivans in Russian history. One was great and one was terrible, if you want to think about it that way. And he finally rips up all obligations to the Mongols altogether. But by then they had all pretty much ceased to apply anyway. So Russia now is reunified under Muscovite, Moscow leadership. But what the Muscovite rulers, who soon call themselves Tsars, you often see it spelled C-Z-A-R, because that's just the way the French say ts, but actually you pronounce it correctly, not Tsar, like Z-A-R, you don't pronounce it Tsar, you pronounce it Tsar, T-S-A-R, Tsar, and sometimes it's spelled T-S-A-R. Well, what does Tsar sound like to you? Caesar, very good. Some of you all know this. Caesar, they were identifying with Byzantium now. They weren't identifying with Boris and Gleb and Vladimir as much as with the great rulers, the emperors of Byzantium, the Caesars of Byzantium. And of course, by the 1400s, when the Russian rulers like Ivan the Great are doing this, he rules in the late 1400s, Ivan the Great. Where is Byzantium? What's going on in Byzantium in the late 1400s?
ashes.
Yeah, it's ashes. Well, that's been taken over by the Turks. Yeah, it's been absolutely destroyed. There is no Byzantium. It's gone. 1453. 1453. No more Byzantium. Constantinople falls to the Turks. 1453 is more or less when these Muscovite rulers now unify Russia, and they do so self-consciously as the kind of the ones that have restored Orthodox Christian statecraft. But they've done so by appropriating it in their own mind the autocracy, not the decentralized, whatever you want to call it, of Vladimir and his successors in Kiev and Russia, but the centralized autocratic system. Tyrannical to the core, but very effective in mobilizing political and military resources to fight enemies like the Mongols. And so the Muscovite Tsars now come to power, and by the early 1500s, we have a reunited Russia, with some exceptions. Kiev remains outside of its scope, but a lot of other places like Novgorod have been reunited, gathered together. There have been also some important religious developments before Philip's time in the 1500s. One of these religious developments is the rise of what's called the possessor controversy. As the Russian state became very, very strong under the Muscovite rulers, and autocracy became the new model of government, modeled as it was on Byzantium, the monasteries of Russia, and there were a lot of these, the monasteries are facing a kind of a fork in the road. Some of the monasteries want to follow, all of this grows out of the tradition of Sergius of Radonezh. He left behind in Holy Trinity Monastery north of Moscow, and Sergiev Posad, the town is called, Holy Trinity Monastery. You should know about him if you don't. He almost made his way up onto our ceiling, but didn't quite make the cut, as it were. Forgive me for putting it that way, but we had to figure things out, and I wanted him up there, but I couldn't get him up there, so we have someone else who's associated with him who's going up there. Anyway, Sergiev Radonezh in the late 1300s, dies in 1382, leaves behind this tremendously powerful tradition of monasticism, especially centered on hesychasm, coming from Mount Athos, coming from the Byzantine legacy, prayer of the heart. And so the question is how to keep this going. And one school, one direction, was we keep it going by building strong, powerful, wealthy monasteries where monks can gather and are supported to live lives of prayer. And furthermore can provide a lot of charity and other things. They can develop the liturgy, beautiful liturgy, kingdom of heaven on earth, things like this. So this group is known as the possessors because they said the monasteries should possess lots of wealth that they can then use to glorify God in their monastic life. They known as the possessors. Their leader was a monk called, and now canonized saint, Joseph of Volokolamsk. Joseph of Volokolamsk. And these possessors won out, finally. They were the ones who really, for the time being, won out. But they were opposed by another school of monasticism, which emphasized the kenotic element, the radical emptying element, the element that says we should not possess a thing. We should go off to hermitages as far away from civilization as possible, get away from wealth, get away from big church buildings and enclosed monasteries and responsibilities for feeding the poor. And we should just practice prayer of the heart to our early death. And this school was represented by another saint named Neil Sorsky. And he also was a canonized saint. He and Joseph of Volokolamsk were like opponents, kind of like Peter and Paul are sometimes seen as opponents in the early first century in the question of circumcision and so on. They were opponents over the question of how monasticism gets properly lived out, and they're both canonized saints. So this possessor controversy was a big deal. And but finally, as I said, the possessors more or less win the day. Now, another development in the, you might say, piety, of Russia under the Muscovite state during this period, another element of it is what's called holy folly. foolishness for Christ's sake, getting its origin, its a conception from 1 Corinthians. It says, we are fools for Christ's sake. To the world we look like fools, but actually we're living out our salvation. And so there was a growing movement known as holy folly, or fools for Christ's sake, during this time. The most famous of them, because I won't be able to come back to him, is Basil the Blessed of Moscow. Basil the Blessed, after whom that great cathedral is built, is named today. But there are many such fools, and they lived out that evangelical maximalism by going into society from like a monastic background. They didn't remain in monasteries. Monasteries are places of foolishness. A monk gives up good food. A monk gives up possessions. A monk gives up sex. I mean, what folly that is in our society today. What a foolish thing that would be to do. So the monks from the start look like fools to the rest of the society, but these fools would come into society like Moscow, and they'd interact with people and show the gospel to them in this radical, maximalistic way, living out the ideals of the gospel as fully as they can in confrontation with people that they consider to be lax in their Christianity. So these are some developments then that are taking place in the Muscovite Russia of Philip when he grows up in the early 1500s. And he grows up during the reign and comes to power during the reign of course, that great force in Russian government and history, Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible reigned from 1533 to 1584, which roughly is 50 years, half a century, lived a long time, reigned a long time, came to power as a boy, and very, very soon had a great control over the Russian state. Now, Ivan the Terrible, his name, Terrible, actually is Grozny in Russian, and it's often pointed out, Grozny doesn't necessarily mean like terrible, like what a terrible person that is. It means like overwhelmingly powerful and awesome, someone that, you know, causes you to cower in front of him because of his awesome power and majesty. But it's not a purely negative term, although he is largely a negative figure in historical hindsight. He comes to power with a lot of intelligence, a lot of ambition, and he sets himself from an early age to really serve the Russian state as it had formed in Moscow and its autocracy. And the early part of his reign was actually rather productive from a Russian point of view. Wasn't productive from a Turkish point of view or from a Swedish point of view, but it was quite productive from a Russian point of view. For instance, he expands the territories of Russia, especially to the east. It's under the reign of Ivan the Terrible that Russia becomes a proper empire, in the sense that it's no longer just Russian Orthodox people that live within the state, but there are Turks and Muslims now when Ivan conquers the city in the east called Kazan. And he conquers Kazan, and that brings a large non-Russian but also non-Christian population into his empire. He also undertakes a number of ecclesiastical improvements. For instance, he appoints a very important metropolitan to Moscow named Makary. Makary will be succeeded by Philip. We'll get to him in just a minute. And he also, Makary does a lot of things like adds a tremendous number of Russian saints to the calendar, for instance, to the Meneon, the Russian Meneon. So there's a more of a sense that the Russians have their own, they're not just praying to Byzantine or Greek saints, they have their own saints, not only Boris and Gleb, but other Russian saints. And so Russia develops a greater sense of her sense as a national community defined by her Orthodox Christianity under Ivan the Terrible and the influence of Metropolitan Makary. There's a council held. Now, obviously not an ecumenical one, but a big national council is held. It's called the Stoglav Council, and this council does a lot of important work to clarify how church life should be administered. Ivan was very intelligent, and he was literary, and he wrote hymns, actually, for the church. And you can actually listen to some of these hymns. I actually came across a hymn once from Ivan the Terrible. It's like, wow, that's quite a thing to listen to. And then finally, maybe just to throw one last example of the ecclesiastical improvements, he builds St. Basil Cathedral, which many people consider to be one of the most remarkable Orthodox churches on the planet, on Red Square in Moscow. And I'm sure you're all familiar with what that looks like. It's called St. Basil Cathedral. It's really built as the Church of the Intercession of the Virgin Mary, but it gets renamed after Basil, the Blessed, the Fool for Christ, who actually confronted Ivan at one point during his reign, according to his life. I said he had an early productive phase, but he had a later destructive phase, and that's what he's probably most, infamous, notorious for, Ivan the Terrible. And this happens after 1565, so about halfway through his reign. Ivan goes bananas. We don't really know what happened. He had a beloved wife. Anastasia was her name. Anastasia, not Anastasia. Never say Anastasia. It's Anastasia. Okay. Anastasia was his bride, his wife, and he loved her dearly. But then she died suddenly and suspiciously. And a lot of historians for a long time said, oh, it's just that paranoia. He was just paranoid, thought that she had been murdered by some sort of palace intrigue by the noblemen, the boyars who were always against Ivan and autocracy. They always wanted to decentralize the Russian state. But actually, during the Soviet Union, they actually dug up her remains and tested them and found that it does seem like she might have been poisoned, just like Ivan thought. So that's at least what I learned when I was doing graduate work into this period. So maybe Ivan knew what he was talking about. Well, whatever, once she's dead, he just goes off the deep end. He withdraws from politics for a while on the pretense that he's no longer interested in ruling. He hates everyone and everything, and they all hate him, and so he's gone. He goes into a kind of a depression, you might say. But then he comes back, and boy, does he come back with a vengeance. He comes back and he establishes a reign of terror in Russia. The institution he created to institute this reign of terror is called the Oprichnina, and the leaders of it were called Oprichniki, and they were actually clothed in mock monastic garments, like a kind of clergy under Ivan's direct direction. And what their role was to go to various towns and exact from the people in those towns lots of wealth to send back to Ivan, and also to kill off and destroy any potential opposition to Ivan, who by this time is paranoid that he's surrounded by enemies and that everyone's trying to assassinate or kill or subvert his rule. And so the Oprichnina are sent and they start to devastate Russia. It's basically a civil war that unfolds under the Oprichnina. And thousands of people are put to their deaths under Ivan the Terrible. It's an absolutely horrid reign. And, Russia gets a lot of flack about this. This is kind of typical Russian political behavior or something like that. It's worth noting that at this very time, Henry VIII is launching the English Reformation, and he's killing off all sorts of, not only wives to get his longed-for son, but he's also doing things like the pilgrimage of the anti-monastic campaign in the north. Lots of people like Thomas More are being put to death, their heads being put on pikes in London and central London as a terror effort to terrorize Henry VIII's political opponents, often imagined political opponents. So Ivan the Terrible is just a contemporary of Henry VIII, but he is very brutal and very terrible in his rule in this respect. Now, as this is all going on, and now we're reaching Philip, and this is where I'm going to kind of bring things to a conclusion today. As this is all going on, the church is standing back and watching this and wondering, like, is this symphony or is this Caesaropapism, right? I mean, those terms aren't being used as such, probably. Certainly Caesaropapism wasn't. But they're evaluating, what's going on? Like, this ruler we have represents a lot that's, good. I mean, we have an independent Orthodox state. We're no longer ruled by the Mongols. The West and its Roman Catholic and Protestant lands, aren't invading us in any great, terrible way. We have this legacy of going back in time with our Byzantine Greek predecessors. We're proud of our land. We have a strong central state, no longer dominated by the Mongols. Those are all good things. We've done a lot of church improvements. A lot of good things are seen here. Flourishing monasticism, and things like this. But at the same time, this is horrid to see all this violence and cruelty taking place all around us. And so from out of this kind of question emerges Philip. Philip had a background, a little quick background of Philip, at one of those monasteries that received a tremendous amount of wealth and didn't even know what to do with it all. It's Solovetsky Monastery up in the White Sea. Solovetsky Monastery was a very wealthy place by now, and it had a lot of monks. I mean, I want to say hundreds. I don't really know how many were there at this time. And Philip goes there, and he's elevated to become abbot of Solovetsky Monastery. And Ivan the Terrible is sending huge amounts of money to the monastery to help build its churches and, beautify its liturgy and all that kind of stuff. But eventually, after Makary, that I mentioned earlier, who presided at the Stogolav Council that Ivan appointed, is gone. He just dies, and his office is vacated. Ivan decides to pull Philip out of Solovetsky Monastery and make him Metropolitan of Moscow. So Philip comes from Solovetsky, having done a great deal to strengthen and beautify and improve Solovetsky Monastery. He comes to Moscow and becomes Metropolitan in 1566. In 1566, which, by the way, if you're following the dates, is just 1 year after the turn into the destructive, from the productive to the destructive phase of Ivan's rule. He comes to Moscow as Metropolitan in 1566, and almost immediately falls afoul of Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible was launching the Oprichnina at this time. There was a lot of violence. There was a lot of bad stuff happening, and Philip takes it on himself to exercise what was another element in Russian piety, particularly well defined in the tradition of the Russians. And this is something that the Russians call pachalovania. And it's a hard word to translate. It means intercession, but it means more than just intercession. In its usage in church language, in church documents, saints' lives, things like that, it means a kind of sacrificial intercession for the sake of another person. And there's a kind of a piety in Russian Christianity that celebrates sacrificial service to other people by interceding for them. And a really great example of this is an early document from the Kievan Russian period called The Descent of the Virgin into Hell. The Descent of the Virgin into Hell. If you're ever interested in reading this, there's a great collection of early Russian church documents and other documents called Russian Epics, Chronicles, and Tales by Sergei Zenkovsky. He edited it all. It's like one of those 400, 500 page books that gets used, or they're probably not anymore, no one's interested anymore, but was once used widely in university courses, like if you're taking a class in Russian culture or Russian history, the professor, I was one of those, would assign this book to all the students, and we'd read certain documents from this collection. One of the documents is The Descent of the Virgin into Hell, and the scenario was the following. The Virgin Mary desires to descend into hell to see the people who are in hell. Now that sounds a little bit like what? Dante, doesn't it? It comes out earlier, if I'm not mistaken, than Dante's Divine Comedy. And instead of being this, literary masterpiece, it's like you might just say it's a moral, spiritual masterpiece, but it certainly doesn't have the artistic quality that the Divine Comedy does. But it's interesting because the goal is not I mean, I don't want to make too much out of this comparison, but the famous Dante goes into hell in order just to kind of see it and then talk about, the glory of God's providence and love and salvation, but also in a very literary way to kind of see the human experience. But it's a very literary work. The Russian work, The Descent of the Virgin into Hell, is all about her sacrificial suffering for those people in hell. And so she goes through hell and she weeps and weeps and weeps and begs Christ to allow her to continue weeping and suffering for those people in hell. And she wants to see them. She wants to embrace them. She wants to commune with these people who are, who are in hell. I mean, they're damned, they're in hell. But that's where she wants to be. Again, self-emptying, kenosis, right? Kenoticism. Sacrificial love for the other. Renouncing the power. She's the queen of heaven. And yet she wants to be in hell, to be with the people who are suffering there, because she can't stand, just like her son couldn't stand to remain aloof in heaven to see the human race suffering. So she also, as the first and most faithful servant of her son, wants to go to where the human suffering is greatest and intercede. And in her intercession, her Pachalavania for those in hell, Christ agrees one day out of the year to lighten their burden in hell because of her intercession, her Pachalavania. So this is a legendary work that the Russians really loved, that helped really define Russian piety and Russian kind of church life. And Philip of Moscow, finding himself in the face of Ivan the Terrible's Oprichnina and its cruel violence, now begins to act similarly. He begins to criticize Ivan the Terrible. Remember, symphony, Caesaropapism. The rulers expected to work with the bishops, like the Metropolitan of Moscow, but often doesn't and dominates them and works against the interests of the church. In the history of the Orthodox Church, we have far fewer examples, though, of what we often call speaking the truth to power. You've heard that phrase, right? Speaking the truth to power. It describes a situation when, in certain situations of power, certainly that goes for government, but it could be like, you're in an office situation, a company, a business situation, or you're in some other situation, and the power is so great, you're afraid to speak honestly about the fact that the power is being misused and abused, right? Now, in the history of Christianity, the West, especially the Roman Catholic West, earned a very high respect for saints and figures that spoke the truth to power, especially with the rise of papal supremacy after the Great Schism, which placed the papacy, theoretically, above rulers, like Ivan the Terrible, so that the papacy could issue and expect from rulers certain standards of behavior. Like, for instance, like this often gets worked out in demanding that a ruler stop trying to divorce his wife or something like that. Didn't work with Henry VIII, the aforementioned Henry VIII, obviously, but sometimes this kind of thing did. Speaking the truth to power, using the gospel, that evangelical maximalism to check and confront figures with overwhelming power. In the Orthodox tradition, there's very little of this. Very little of this. Very often what happened historically is the bishops, they might have confronted privately or quietly the ruler, but they tended not to threaten the ruler with some sort of excommunication or something like that. In this case, however, Philip does exactly that. He speaks truth to power in the case of Ivan the Terrible. And let me just wrap things up here by bringing attention to his confrontation with Ivan the Terrible as Metropolitan of Moscow, appointed by Ivan himself. This was a very daring thing for him to do. But this is what Philip does. And you're going to hear the phrase that's actually going to be on the scroll that Philip holds up in our ceiling here, in this reading here. This is what he said when he came to Moscow. He confronted the sovereign and he says, "O sovereign, our faith will be in vain and the apostolic message will be in vain. And the holy traditions of our holy fathers will be of no avail. Even all the good deeds which flow from Christian teaching will be pointless. and the very incarnation of our Lord, who became man for the sake of our salvation, will be in vain if we now drop that which God has entrusted to us. He's speaking us like me personally. If I now don't go forward and confront you and call you to stop this violence, what God has entrusted to us, so that we can be in accord with this immorality you're committing. And this will not be. God will punish you for all of this, for it has brought about division in the realm. I do not grieve for those who innocently are shedding their blood and are dying as martyrs, because this present temporary suffering, in the words of the apostles, is nothing compared with that glory which will be revealed to us. But for your salvation I do grieve. And these were the kinds of words he spoke to Ivan the Terrible. Let's see if I got that. Yeah. And here's another statement. Desist, O sovereign, Ivan, from such profane deeds as you are doing. Recall former tsars. Remember, like Vladimir or Boris maybe. Remember that those who did good are kindly remembered after death, but that those who did evil, like you, to their realm are no longer held in reverence. You too should attempt to imitate good morals. You must remember that your high earthly rank has no control over death, which sinks its invincible teeth into everything. And thus, before death's unmerciful coming, cultivate the fruits of a virtuous man and store up your treasure in heaven. For everything gathered in this world remains here. Remember that each must answer for his own life. Well, finally, he confronted Ivan in the very Kremlin itself in Moscow, in the cathedral, Uspensky Cathedral. I think that's Dormishin Cathedral. There are several cathedrals in Moscow, at Kremlin, and I think it was the Dormishin Cathedral. Excuse me just for a minute or one. Germans. What's that? Yeah. We're just finishing with Philip. Yeah, just want to come around. You did. Well, come on in. We have everyone here, and then we'll have a chance to greet you properly, if you like, or right afterward. We're almost there. Almost there. Come in and have a seat.
Here.
Okay, so one final quote, and this is after he gets arrested. What happens is at Uspensky Cathedral, I think that's it, he's serving the Divine Liturgy. At the end of the liturgy, what does the bishop do? What does the bishop do? He offers the cross, or there's a priest to offer the cross. And so Ivan comes forward first, because he's the Tsar, comes forward to kiss the cross, and as he comes forward, Philip does this. He does something like this. He pulls the cross back, and you can just imagine this embarrassment that Ivan the Terrible would have felt, like this Gosudar, this powerful, almighty Tsar comes forward to kiss the cross humbly, and the bishop pulls it back, and so he can't kiss the cross, and so he always carried a staff with him. Have you ever seen the painting? I think it's by Repin, the great 19th century Russian realist painter, called The Death of Ivan Tsarevich. And you see Ivan the Terrible son. He beat his son to death. I guess I should just throw that out. It's part of his profile. And he beat his son to death with his staff. So he always carried this kind of staff around with him. When Philip does this and denies him the cross and humiliates him publicly at the end of the liturgy, he takes his staff, and you might think he's going to hit Philip. He doesn't, but he does bring the staff right down on the railing, right in front of the iconostasis there. And he threatens Philip, and then goes out with all of his oprichniki after him, wearing their black mock monastic garments. And indeed, Philip is then arrested, taken to a monastery, and these are some of his last words recorded. I have taken all of this for your good. Remember the Pachalovania, right? The suffering, sacrificial intercession for others. That's why Philip did this. I have taken all of this for your good, so that your trouble will be pacified. If it was not for my love for you, I would not have wanted to remain here for even a day. But God's word held me. A good shepherd gives up his life for his sheep. A good shepherd gives up his life for his sheep. Those are words of Christ, of course, right? Do not be disturbed. All this discord is from the devil. Is from the devil and not from God, who has permitted it and God is our helper. Christ is with us. Whom are we to fear? I am ready to suffer. For you and your love will weave a crown for me in the next world. Victory is accompanied by pain, but I beg you, do not abandon hope. God punishes us, but with love and also for the good of our redemption. Our words are not from foreigners, but from our own people. Bear grief from them joyously, for God has commanded that we do good to those who hate us. Remember, evangelical maximalism, right? We do good to those who hate us. Boris, right? Just like we were talking about earlier, Boris the Passion Bearer. God in his kindness will bring everything to a good purpose in this world. And with that, and some of the last words he spoke. Soon afterward, one of the oprichniki came in on Ivan's orders and strangled him and killed him. And the date was December 23rd, like just on the eve of Christmas almost, 1569. And that's the end of the life, in this age anyway, of St. Philip of Moscow, whose icon will be up there on our ceiling for us to contemplate, to think about, and to remember in the time ahead. Okay? So that's it. It's wonderful to have you, Your Eminence, with us today. I want to just ask quickly, are there any questions? We're really over time, so I don't want to, if there's something really urgently that should be asked in terms of a question after that, I can entertain that, but otherwise I think we better scoot into the temple where we're going to do our Moleben. Yeah? Okay, good. So Christine, I guess I'll give you a minute or two to put things together and we'll get started. Okay. Okay, very good, very good.